In 1993, the Conservative government under John Major passed the Railways Act, which instigated the privatisation of railways in Britain. This saw an integrated system of British Rail being broken up into different sectors, all having their own responsibility on the railways. This video will walk through how the different sectors run Britain's railways. The first thing to look at is on the rail operations. This is essentially split up into two main entities, the rail service provider and the infrastructure provider, which can also be known as vertical separation. Let's start off with the owner of the railway infrastructure itself, Network Rail. Network Rail is the primary owner of the railway infrastructure in Britain, which includes 2,500 stations, 20,000 miles of track, 40,000 bridges and viaducts, and thousands of tunnels, level crossings and signals. They also manage 18 of Britain's largest stations, including London's King's Cross, London Waterloo and Manchester Piccadilly. The company's responsibility is looking after the maintenance of the railway and upgrading the infrastructure to meet future demands. Network Rail is a publicly owned company with no shareholders, meaning that the railway infrastructure in Britain is essentially nationalised. There are two main revenue streams which Network Rail has to be able to fund its work on the railway: government funding and access charges to train companies. Through owning the railway, Network Rail charges the train companies a fee to operate on their railway, which is called a track access charge. On top of this, they also lease out the management of train stations to the train operating companies. For example, stations such as Sheffield Train Station is managed by East Midlands Trains and Newcastle Station by Virgin Trains East Coast, therefore being the consumer face to the rail industry. Next, let's have a look at the people who run the railway services themselves. These are called train operating companies. They are split up into two groups, franchised operators and open access operators. By far the biggest use of the railways are franchised operators and have the biggest presence on the railways, which include Virgin Trains and Northern Rail. The responsibility of these companies are to run the rail services, negotiate with the government, and include setting the timetable of the trains, the level of service they provide, and operate the majority of stations throughout Britain. Franchised operators compete to win a franchise before it will begin, during a bidding process in which they put forward their tender to how they would run the railway and how much they would expect to pay the government for the privilege. Once the franchise has been awarded, that's when the competition ends, and the winning bidder can in most cases run their services with little competition. There are currently 17 franchise services, with each lasting for a maximum of 15 years and can be further extended for up to 7.5 years. As mentioned before, train operating companies pay a fee to use the railway infrastructure to run their services on, which is called a track access charge. They are also responsible for staffing costs. In return, they get their income through ticket sales to passengers who use their services. Train operating companies are also responsible for letting out retail space in stations, receiving an income from this. The other type of passenger services are open access operators, who make up a very small presence on the railway network, with less than 1% of all services nationwide in 2017. The open access operators operate on the East Coast Main Line as Grand Central Railways and First Haul trains, making up 15% of the services on the line. Open access operators bid for slots in the timetable on the railways and are not subject to franchising responsibilities. They operate with no subsidy and are able to set their own fares, not being subjected to fare regulations. As the majority of rail services are subjected to franchising, which is only awarded for a certain amount of time, it does not make financial sense for the train companies to own rail stock. This is where rolling stock companies come in. Rolling stock companies own and maintain the trains, leasing them to train companies. There are three big rolling stock providing companies, which are called Angel Trains, Eversholt Rail and Porterbrook Leasing, and own 89% of all the trains on the railway as of March 2017. There is only a finite amount of train stock which is leased to train companies. If you ever see a train pulling up at a platform with not enough carriages, this is likely to be down to there not being enough carriages available, although more investment is going into building and upgrading of the rolling stock. The management of the railways themselves comes from the government and in particular the Department for Transport. The Department for Transport oversees the whole franchising process, evaluating and awarding of rail franchises across England. In Scotland and Wales, this responsibility has been devolved to the respective governments. This means that they are an important player in shaping the franchise requirements, whether that be the money the train company will pay to the government or the minimum service levels they are required to have for their passenger services. They most notably have an influence on fares that passengers pay as well. Train fares on Britain's railways are split up into two types of fares: regulated and unregulated fares. Regulated fares have their prices controlled by the government and include season tickets and most return fares, and only apply on franchise services. Unregulated fares are controlled by train operating companies, so they have the freedom to set prices how they like. The type of tickets included are first class and standard class advance tickets. The Department for Transport also decides the level of subsidies it gives out or premiums that train companies are required to pay to the government on top of their track access charges. Not all railways are created equal. Some railways are more well used than others and generate more money. However, people rely on trains as a means of connecting areas together, especially rural areas. In a fully privately funded railway, it would not make financial sense to run a train service, leading to closures of the railway. This is where subsidies come in. Subsidies are given by the government to the rail companies to run services in areas which are not well used, making it financially viable for operators to run the services. Examples include Northern Rail and ScotRail, which are both given net subsidies to run their services. Rail services, which have a lot of passengers using them, particularly services in and around London, can be subject to premium payments. This is where rail companies are required to make a payment to the government instead of receiving a subsidy. Only 2 franchises actually paid premiums to the government in 2017, South West Trains and Virgin Trains East Coast. The monitoring of the railways is done by the Office of Rail and Road through both economic and safety regulations, helping to protect the interest of rail users. This includes the regulation of Network Rail, helping to control access to the rail network by train operating companies and ensure that safety standards remain one of the highest in Europe. Finally, there is the public, who pay and use the rail services that are provided. They play an important role throughout the length of a franchise, whether that be by helping to shape a franchise during the bidding process, or through satisfaction surveys to help monitor standards of a train operator. To summarise, the responsibility for the infrastructure lies with Network Rail and the rail services with the train operating companies. Franchises are awarded from the Department of Transport to the train operating companies to run the rail services in a particular area. To run the services, train operating companies are required to pay access charges to Network Rail for use of the tracks. In addition to this, Network Rail receives money from the government through grants, with all this helping to fund the maintenance and upgrades of the railway infrastructure. Depending on the usage of the franchise, train operating companies are required to pay premiums to the government for heavily used franchises and may receive subsidies for low-used ones. Train operating companies also lease their trains through rolling stock companies, which they are required to pay to. The Office of Rail and Road provides regulation throughout the rail industry. This includes licences to train operating companies and regulations to Network Rail, which ensure that Britain's railways remain one of the safest in Europe. Finally, the train operating companies gain revenue through fares by providing services to passengers, thus completing the structure of how the railways run in Britain.